Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. And this week I have a guest with me, Sarah Geis. So welcome and thanks for coming on with us, Sarah.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And Sarah is the director of the Gordon Lewis Center for Christian Thought and Culture at Denver Theological Seminary. And she also teaches apologetics and ethics at the Denver Seminary there, as well as working on a PhD from the University of Birmingham in England. So you've got a lot of stuff going on, pretty busy.
Oh, yeah, it's insane, but it's good.
Cool. So I asked Sarah to come on because I saw a Facebook post she put up about a talk she was doing. It was for Ratio Christi organization, is that right?
Yeah, Ratio Christi at the Colorado School of Mines.
Fantastic. So the summary that she gave that caught my interest is, she said, most people are caught in the lie that our only options are to tell the truth or to show love. If we aren't committed to telling the truth, we lose the trust of others. But on the other hand, if we don't love, we lose the respect of others. This is a false dichotomy because there is a third option, to tell the truth with love, which means carefully, at the right time, and out of a desire to see someone flourish. However, that third option is harder, which is why most of us only choose our favorite half of the equation. And I thought that was pretty cool and sounded exactly like the kind of thing I'd like to be promoting here on this podcast. So I invited Sarah to come on and essentially we'll go through the talk she gave, and because that's what I want to be all about. So
excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to it. There's a lot here too. So
I looked through your outline and you touch on so many different things, which I always think is a sign of a pretty good philosophical work when you can go through that and think, well, there's 5 things I wish I could have gone through in more depth. So
that always happens. And even, that little quote, everything I do on Facebook, I try to make it just a little interesting nugget that sort of captures the essence of what we're getting at. And then the philosophical underpinnings or the philosophical foundation, though, usually requires a lot of time to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't expect anybody on Facebook to ever really read that much on Facebook, but at least maybe I can get them interested in listening to your podcast, and we can then unpack it there.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to do. My wife tells me that I try to be way too intellectual on Facebook, where I'll find these quotes that I think are like really deep and insightful and really challenging, and I'll put them up and I'll get 3 or 4 likes. And then I'll put up a funny story where my daughter said she liked seeing me play Spider-Man on the PlayStation, and suddenly 50, 60 people like that. So.
Oh yeah. My biggest hits on Facebook are the stuff I post about my crazy dog Murphy. So.
Oh yeah, I've seen some of those. Yeah.
Oh yeah. He's a celebrity. But the philosophical stuff, now you got to bait people into diving deeper into it with you in some other setting.
Yeah. Well, getting back on track, how did that talk at Ratio Christi go? Was that well received? Did you get any pushback, or
I think so. I think it was. It was really enjoyable. It was one of those things where I think the club there is already really solid, and they really didn't need much help, I don't think, other than maybe I was able to lay some thoughts out in a way that were organized differently than what they'd originally, or what they've heard in the past, or maybe some ideas that they hadn't heard before. But for the most part, that group is a really rock solid group, and I was really happy to be a part of it. I was just trying to help them see a different angle in doing apologetics and doing philosophy.
Good deal. Well, awesome. Well, why don't we just dive right into your talk? You just start us off by actually, I had thought it'd be fun to first off ask you kind of a frivolous question, which is, are there any philosophical positions you hold that other philosophers would say are definitely wrong or crazy, the kind of things that would get you odd looks if you said them at a philosophy conference?
Oh, yes. Actually, I did one of these at their most recent EPS meeting that was here in Denver.
Oh, yeah.
And I've actually got several of these ideas, but one of them, and this is what I'm doing my PhD on, is that I actually think the Cartesian ontological argument has more merit than most people think that it does. So that's Descartes' version of the ontological argument for God, which I'm not convinced that it, in its classical sense, in its original formulation, is sufficient. But I think that it's a good start, and I think it's stronger than what most people think.
Okay.
Yeah. So and I don't want to get into that because that would take up all our time.
It would. I understand. I wrote my MA thesis on the modal ontological argument and dealt with Descartes a little bit, so I know right what you're talking about, and maybe someday I'll have to have you back on and we can go back and forth on that, because I kind of came away with a more negative assessment of Descartes' version.
Most people do. That's okay. Don't worry.
Yeah. But overall, I'd agree with you that it's definitely a much stronger argument than the hand-wave dismissals most people give it warrant. Even if it doesn't work, it still is much deeper and much more insightful than they tend to admit. So
that's very true. So there's other things too, but I'll just leave that one out there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, why don't you just dive right into the talk and just walk us through? And if I think we need clarification on a term or I have some questions or something, I'll just, politely interrupt you. So
Good. You don't have to be polite either. Don't worry about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can just interrupt, as directly as you feel like. The reason that I wanted to kind of come up with a talk like this for an apologetics group specifically is because when Christians defend the faith, the Christian faith, I think a lot of the time we seem to sort of assume that most people that we are up against are atheists and don't believe in any sort of spirituality, or maybe they're naturalistic agnostics. They only believe in the natural world, but they don't necessarily know if there's a God or not, but fundamentally they're naturalists. And I don't think sociologically, if you look at the data and look at actually the amount of people who say they believe in God, which actually is 1/3 of Americans who believe in some sort of higher power, and that comes from a very recent Pew study. And if you want to look it up, it's from 2018, and it's called.
I would have thought it would be a little higher, like maybe half or something.
Yeah,
did they define it in an odd way or something? Higher power.
I don't know. You'll have to look it up of how they defined it, because here's what it's called. When Americans say they believe in God, what do they mean? That's actually the title of this study. Okay. And so it goes into more depth than that. But 1/3 believe in a higher power. And I know that more than that believe in some sort of spiritual realm. Maybe not necessarily higher, but something that's spiritual. So that would encompass people like Buddhists and people that don't necessarily believe in a God, but there is more to life than the natural world. So that's more like, at least classical Buddhism is more like a non-naturalistic atheism. So anyway, all that to say that we leave out, as Christian apologists, a lot of the time we leave out this massive chunk of people. And whether or not it's a third or a half, it's a large group. And I think that we need to realize that when we only address atheists, then we're leaving on the table the question of, okay, if spirituality, if somebody believes in generalized spirituality or some other religion, what do we do with that? How do we discuss the fact that maybe there are some ideas in that realm that are not true? And that's a very contentious issue. So anyway, my kind of part of my argument for why so many people, or what many people believe about the spiritual world, is that a lot of people are fascinated with ghost stories, ghost encounters, afterlife talk, that kind of stuff. So you see that on the Travel Channel even, which is funny to me.
That is
Travel Channel. I guess you do have to travel to find them, so maybe that's the connection, but we also have a conscience. People talk about conscience all the time. Well, that's non-physical. That's not part of the brain necessarily. Now, there is a philosophical discussion to be had there, but for the most part, most people, when they refer to your conscience, they're not necessarily talking about your brain. They're talking about some feeling that we have that that determines whether or not something is right or wrong, or at least signals rightness or wrongness in an action or series of actions. The concept of love is non-physical. That's something kind of mysterious and different, and that's something that people are fascinated with. And then there's math, which I believe is non-physical fundamentally. If you write a number on a whiteboard, obviously that's physical, but it's that right there is not the number. That's a symbol that represents the number.
Yeah, the number 2 is an abstract object, if you can even call it an object at all. Actually, I know the grounding or possible grounding of math is actually an extremely controversial subject in philosophy, and I just haven't taken the time to research that in depth yet. But if it is an object, it's an abstract object. It's not a physical thing.
Right. So life is full of what I kind of call hauntings of the non-physical. We see and experience, and even if we're not sure if God exists or any kind of supernatural exists, we are haunted by this reality that there's stuff in the universe that cannot easily be explained through the material world alone.
Yes.
In the system of the closed system of a naturalistic world.
Yeah, I've liked devolving into philosophy of the mind. I've listened to some lectures on that, read a couple of books, and there's as I'm sure you well know, some extremely technical, very complicated arguments for that. But I've always thought, well, one that's just so obviously simple is, by virtue of being human beings, we seem to be intimately aware of what matter is, because our own bodies are obviously composed of matter. But we're also intimately aware of our own thoughts. In fact, arguably, that might be you're studying Descartes. That might be the most intimately aware thing you can be the most intimately aware of, is your own thoughts. And those are obviously not material, because the properties that are applied to your thoughts just do not apply to your matter, to your body. You could divide up my body, you could chop me up into pieces. You can't really chop up my thoughts. And I'm located in a place, but it's kind of difficult to say my thoughts are located in a place. That's at least certainly not in the same sense. And there's so many other things you can go on.
Their temperature.
Yeah. So I've always thought that that's, I would guess to say, it's just kind of intuitively obvious. Maybe you might even want to say, and I'm a little reluctant to go this way, the default position that there's a material and non-material aspect to life, and people who are going to say differently probably have the burden to say that, because it's just so intuitively obvious to everyone, because we all have bodies and we all have minds. And I certainly hope we all have thoughts. I've met some people who make me wonder, but
especially when they're on their cell phones.
Yes.
Yeah, and one of the best arguments that I've heard for this too. There's lots of arguments for why the mind is not the brain, but as you know. But one of my favorites is the argument from what's called intentionality, and I won't go into this in great detail, or else we will run out of time. But the argument from intentionality is that my thoughts are about something. They don't just happen and have no direction. So if I think about lunch, I'm thinking about something out there in the world, and that sending of a thought, so to speak, or directing of a thought, that can't be physical either, because this aboutness is some kind of abstract concept. It's not. If I have a thought in my head, there's no reason why it shouldn't just sit there until it disappears, and not have any. I have to actually get up and go do something with it because I'm deciding to. And that process of kind of deciding aboutness, like I said, is very, very hard to interpret physically.
Yes. It's I guess you could say that a rock is never about anything. It's just a rock. But you and I right now, we're talking about your talk that you gave at Ratio Christi, some of your ideas. Well, a rock can't do that. So there's some kind of a disconnect there at some level.
Right. So all that to say, the world that we live in is not nearly as obviously physical as what most of us think non-Christians assume. I would argue that most non-Christians that I've encountered have actually been more aware of this non-physical component to the world, and they just don't know what to do with it. So they'll attach themselves to some traditional or fascinating religion or traditional spirituality just to try to make some sense of it, but often they don't really know what direction to go.
Yeah, I'd say that that's more in line with my experience as well. Most of the non-Christians I've met, even people who don't claim any religious affiliation, are not hardcore atheists, hardcore naturalists who say the physical is all there is and that's it. In fact, many of them are, I'd say, shockingly open to like stories of ghosts and other spirits and things along those lines.
Yeah. So then the next step, so that's kind of step one, is basically making the case for why debating atheists and why arguing with atheists is not the only thing that we should be doing. It is not the only interesting discussion that we can have. So that's number one. And then step two kind of is then, okay, if that's the case, well, what do we do with the fact that most people seem to think that the spiritual realm or religion is not really an area where truth applies? So you do have a lot of people who do have some sort of belief in or assumption of the spiritual world, but most of them seem to say things like, oh, well, to each his own, or really there's no truth. Everybody's kind of aiming at the same direction. As long as you're sincere, which is a big key word, big buzzword, as long as you're sincere, you're going in the right direction. Well, what if that's not necessarily true? What if we disagree about what the right direction is or where the direction is going? How can you even know that you're going in the right direction then? So that's what I want to really challenge people with, is to say, being sincere in a religion and being interested in spirituality and recognizing that you have a spiritual side is not going to cut it unless you actually recognize where you're headed. Because a lot of people want to say, well, it's just the journey that matters. It's not the destination. Well, that's not true. That isn't how we journey.
Absolutely. People who believe that, have them tell you, did you ever hate the ending to a book or a movie? Well, did the ending ruin the whole thing for you? Then it's obviously not just the journey. The ending matters too.
It does. It does. And even if you don't know where you're going, you still are trying to consult maps and orient yourself. So there's still an attempt to figure out where you're going, even if you are lost. So we still want to be truth directed as human beings, even if we don't know where we're going. So yeah, the destination does matter, and the direction does matter.
Yeah, and I've often said to people, I agree with you on sincerity, that I think you could say that sincerity is probably often a sign of integrity, but it's not necessarily going to be a sign of truth, because you can be sincerely wrong. And I know, because I have been sincerely wrong before in my life about a number of different things. So.
Oh, me too. Me too. And one of the things too that we can use is a philosophical term, or a couple of philosophical terms, that sincerity is necessary for maybe good character, good direction, but it's not sufficient for truth. Necessary, but not sufficient. We can apply that. You've heard those terms. They apply all over philosophy, but they fit here too.
That phrase gets used almost in probably every philosophy conference more times than I can count. So
yes, it does. It does. So, if we're going to figure out this, if we're going to kind of approach the concept of truth in religious views or truth in spirituality, we have to know what we're up against in our culture, because most of the time when you try to broach this subject, you are going to get comments like, well, to each his own, stuff like we already talked about. All roads lead to Rome, that kind of stuff. Which they wouldn't say Rome now because that refers to the Catholic Church, but you get my drift. All roads lead to God in some sense.
It's still a popular saying, even though that's not the way people tend to think anymore.
Right. Yeah. So here's some things we need to think about. First of all, our culture, and this is good, our culture does value diversity. That's a good thing. Diversity in ideas, diversity in background, that kind of stuff. But here's the problem, is that diversity is a good thing, but then when you pair it with either being confused about what truth means or a culture that really isn't interested in finding truth at all in the context of religion, then diversity becomes kind of all there is. It becomes the king. And when diversity is king without truth, then you cannot evaluate differences. So there's some different differences like race that we shouldn't weigh races against each other, right? But there's other kinds of diversity, like diversities of ideas that contradict each other, that we should evaluate, that we should weigh against one another. But in the absence of truth, diversity is all there is. And when that happens, then the assumption that people make, because there is no other option, is that truth is relativistic. It depends on your context. It depends on where you're coming from and who you are.
Yeah, I actually can think of a little story I can tell that makes that point perfectly. I think I told it in the first podcast I did. Back in, this would be 2016, I went to the APA meeting in Kansas City, the American Philosophical Association, and whoever the president of the Central Association was that year, she gave her keynote address like they do every time. And it was on diversity in philosophy. And they'd done a big thing like the year before where they'd sent out surveys asking people, well, do we need more diversity in philosophy? Are minority groups represented? How can we get more of them? And at a point, and I don't remember the exact statistics. You could look it up. It's in the proceedings if anybody cares. But the vast majority of the people surveyed were all in favor of diversity, but there were a few dissenting voices, and the president read some of their quotes and kind of mocked them because they were saying things like, diversity is just a buzzword for people who think metaphysics is something we should abandon in philosophy, or something along those lines. And it was very obvious from the way she presented the speech that she didn't think very well at all of those people who were the dissenting voices. And two things occurred to me in that, which is the first is she never defined what she meant by diversity. And so did she mean, like you're kind of getting at, diversity of ideas in the sense, should we compare Plato's philosophical ideas to third wave feminist philosophers and see who comes out on top? Well, I think that's a great idea. But did she mean that, or did she mean, let's get a bunch of people in here who look different than us, talk a little different than us, but think exactly like us? She was never... Right. Yeah. And as you're saying it now, I can't help but think back on that and think, well, you're right. Diversity was the king because there was no real conception of let's get at what's true. It was, let's just bring in diversity. That's the be all. That's the end all. That's our goal. Right. And if we get that, then everything else is fine. There was no sense of, well, let's bring in different ideas and see which one's true.
Exactly. So what we have in the religious context, if we look at diversity with respect to religion, you've got Christians, you've got Muslims, you've got people who are vaguely spiritual in some sort of Oprah sense. You've got Jewish people of all stripes. You've got a lot of different diverse religious paths and ideas. And in the absence of a clear understanding of truth, all we have to go on is just that they're all on the same level. They're all interesting. They're all just simply different rather than competing. and competing for truth, not competing in any sort of, I'm not suggesting a warfare sort of competing or any sort of physical competing. I mean simply competing on the in the realm of ideas. So that's something that we need to recapture, is what is truth, and is truth attainable? Is truth something that we can work toward together as a society? Is it something that even if we don't have a handle on, can we still respect truth and desire truth enough to have very careful and very linear conversations? And one of the things that I think is challenging to people here is that as our world globalizes, and this is partly due to technology, because we've got smartphones and internet that can connect us to all corners of the globe at this point, except North Korea, but you know that they'll get there someday, I believe.
Hope so, yeah.
But you can connect to so many different ideas and people in the world. And so what used to be the case prior to this globalization is that we would talk to people who were like us because they were near us. So we had a tendency to be around just the same group of people over and over and over, and ideas started to kind of mix and meld with each other's, and you didn't really have much contact with foreign ideas and different exotic people and places and things like that. So now we're actually encountering these other religions, these other people, other ideas, and we find, shockingly, that a lot of times they're smart and likable people. And when people are smart and likable, you don't really want to upset them, and you just want to be their friend. You kind of want to say, wow, I really have a lot of respect for your sincerity. You know, I don't want to get into an argument about it. So let's find our common ground. Let's find where we're similar, and let's just focus on that. Yeah. And then you completely lose the discussion of differences.
Yeah.
So, here's something that we can also look at.
Okay.
The role of truth in society. Most of the time, when it has to do with science, when it has to do with the physical world, it's very few people are going to deny that there is truth. There's such a thing as truth. But then when you cross over into morality and religion, most of the time people are either subjective, where it's personal preference, or maybe they'll say it's culturally relative, or then it could be pragmatic, which is whatever works for you, basically. And that's sort of a version of subjective truth, really, because what works for people differs across people, right?
Of those three, pragmatism is probably the best, because you can't make it up as you go along, but at the same time it isn't objective either. So
right, and what's pragmatic, what works, there's no reason to attach true to what works. That concept of truth is sort of an extra step, because you can lie to yourself and it can work for you.
I can lie to other people and it can work very well if I'm clever enough about it. So right. So truth is it's sort of ad hoc to attach truth to what works. So even there, I think it falls far short. So another cultural challenge to the idea that there can be a truth in religion is this idea of tolerance, that sometimes if you disagree with someone, you're not being tolerant. Because tolerance today has come to mean something like accepting a belief, accepting an idea, not just accepting the person. But that's another thing we have to sort of reclaim, is the idea that, you can accept a person and like a person and be friends with a person and not accept every one of their ideas. You just don't have to be a jerk about it. Yeah, that's so prevalent. I notice it all the time in discussions I have with people and discussions I observe, where there's this idea now that tolerance means you have to say I'm right. Not the classical definition of tolerance was more, I forget the guy who said it, but it was I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Right.
And now it's not like that at all. Do you have any idea how that change happened, where the shift came in, or something like that? I've wondered about that a lot myself.
Oh, that's such a great question. I think that when truth, the idea of truth as, and I'll just introduce this concept now. The concept of truth that I believe in is the correspondence theory of truth. So it's
Yeah.
the idea that truth is what lines up with reality. So an idea is only true if reality dictates it is true. So I don't get to dictate that it's true.
Yeah. It's
Um,
true you and I are talking over the internet, recording this podcast right now, because that actually is what we're doing.
Right, exactly. So once something like the correspondence theory of truth is out of the picture, and truth is now what you determine, because there is nothing out there in the universe that determines truth. We have no idea what that even means. And if that's the case, then you're the master of your own truth. You're the only option. Excuse me for coughing.
Oh, no problem.
So at that point, tolerance has to mean acceptance, because the person and the idea are now the same, because the idea is not about anything out there in the universe, because that's irrelevant at this point. There either is nothing out there, or we can't know it anyway. And so if you reject an idea, you're now rejecting a person.
Interesting. I'll think some more about that. So in a certain sense, then you could say that you are saying it's tied to a rejection of the correspondence theory of truth, but you could almost say it's also tied to maybe a rise in certain types of existentialism or philosophical idealism as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So
interesting.
An analogy that I'll use here is the analogy of a dartboard. Or a game of darts. So if the correspondence theory of truth, let's assume that the correspondence theory of truth is the case. And if that is the case, then the game of darts that would look like is an actual dartboard out there somewhere in a room that's not a part of you, that is some other place. And then your ideas are the darts that you're throwing at the dartboard, and you're seeing how close to the actual target you can get.
Yeah.
That's the truth quest, right? So you are not what determines truth. Your aim is what determines the truth.
Okay.
And then if that's gone, if there is no dartboard out there in the universe, then your darts are kind of whatever you want them to be, and you can determine where, if you throw a dart, since there's no dartboard out there, you can basically determine that it hit the bullseye, because you are the one who determined your own bullseye.
Yeah.
Nobody else can challenge you. So
I remember trying to do that as a kid when I was playing games with my brothers. Well, not with darts, but that exact type thing. No, I meant to do that. That's the way this game is played.
Right, exactly. So because there's no way to challenge each other in this kind of universe, then you have to just accept everyone's, you kind of have to take everyone at face value and say, oh, okay, well, I guess that's true for you then. Good job. I'm happy for you.
And we would have to do that even in cases of things that we would find abhorrent. Like a few years back, my wife and I went and saw Chichen Itza in Mexico, where the Mayans performed a bunch of brutal human sacrifices. And if I was talking to the ancient Mayans, I'd then kind of have to just look at them and say, well, I guess that's your thing, because there really isn't a basis for me to condemn them for that then.
Right. And that's one of the majorly unfortunate logical conclusions of this view. Very few people go that far. But if you're very consistent, that's there. I can't find a way out of that.
Yeah.
So, let's move into the idea then, given all of this, that all roads lead to God. Well, that's what's called philosophical pluralism. That's the conclusion that since we are in a diverse, a spiritually diverse world, then everybody is therefore correct. Well, here's what's weird about that, because if you do want to believe that, then it makes no sense, because all religions have some irreconcilable difference with some other religion. So you're going to find not just different origin stories, but contradictory origin stories.
Mm-hmm.
Such as some religions say the universe has always existed. So that's Hinduism. Mm-hmm. There's others too. Christianity says, no, the universe had a definitive beginning. It had a creation out of nothing. So that's vastly contradictory. You also have different anthropologies, different accounts of humanity. Some people think that humans were created by God, and that's, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Then you have other religions that'll say, no, humans have to some extent always existed. It's just that we are reincarnating and morphing into different things, right? There's sort of a continuation there that's an eternal, infinite continuation, but the mode of existence changes. Then you have different ultimate realities. So God in Christianity is ultimate reality. God in Judaism and in Islam is ultimate reality. He is what is supreme. But then you've got other religions like Buddhism that say, no, ultimate reality is nothingness. Yeah. There's nothing, no God. So how in the world can we say, oh yeah, those two roads are leading to the same God? Well, for one, Buddhism isn't even leading to God. So
yeah, and it doesn't claim to be. God. So
right. So that's absurd. There's different accounts of evil. No, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was going to say, I couldn't agree with you more. And I say this is, I'm a Christian follower of Christ, but I genuinely like Buddhism. I enjoy reading Buddhism philosophy and stories and things like that. So I think that even though I'm not a Buddhist and don't intend to be, I say this thinking that there are some things about it that are good and appealing and worth my time, but it's not at all the same thing as what Christ taught. They're just so radically different. And if you're going to claim otherwise, you either don't know what you're talking about or you're probably being dishonest.
Right. Absolutely. And that leads, I mean, there's other examples of these enormous differences, but I won't get into them all. So fundamentally, if you want to believe that all roads lead to God and pluralism is true, meaning that all religions are true, then you have to be anti-religious knowledge. You can't really dive deeply into knowing different religions, because this view of pluralism requires purely superficial knowledge of each religion. You can only stay on the surface level where there's some vague similarities between each one, such as morality. Maybe you can say, oh, we're all moral. Well, if you dig deep into that, you realize, for one, what counts as moral is going to differ a lot of the time. And then two, why we should even care about being moral is going to differ. So that's the deep level. But the superficial level shows, oh, well, we're all moral people and we want to be moral. Great. Well, it's a lot more than that.
I seem to recall I heard, I think it was Ravi Zacharias summed this up one time where he said, you have often heard people say that all religions are superficially different but fundamentally the same, but they got it backwards. Religions are superficially similar but fundamentally different.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And Ravi's a really good resource on this too, because he came out of Hindu culture, Hindu climate.
That's right.
Yep. Yeah. So let's move into then, if this is the case, if we've established now that all religions cannot be right, there is some kind of benefit to pursuing truth, or at least discussing and evaluating religions with the idea of aiming at truth. Well, there's going to be communication challenges to people, to discussing this with people. So first of all, we're going to have to overcome our outrage culture. People that just cannot handle you disagreeing with them, because not only are you attacking their very essence, their character, because they're convinced that they are their ideas, but they will get so angry that you can't even really defend your position or talk your way out of it. They just shout you down.
Yes.
Because and this is what I've determined, that the best way, this is actually a really kind of smart tactic if you don't have any way of intelligently discussing an idea, because the best way out of a difficult conversation is to paint your opponent as someone so nuts that there's no reason to take them seriously. So that's like, you're a racist, you're a Nazi, you're evil, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you can. Well, President Trump's State of the Union address was just last night, and you can see the two political parties constantly doing that to each other, where the only way they could think differently than I do is if there must be something wrong with them, so they must be evil. And
right,
and they say that about each other constantly. Yeah, it's absolutely a conversation stopper. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to be.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Oh well, I was going to say I think of an example of that just a week or two ago, where somebody in my family posted one of those memes on Facebook or something that said something along the lines of, well, political conservatives don't care about the death penalty, guns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, the only reason they must be against abortion is because they want to control women's bodies, which is doing exactly that thing. And so I tried to politely push back against that a little bit, and at least one of them, it was two members of my family I was talking to. At least one of them didn't respond, but the other one was I don't know if she quite got it, but she didn't leave thinking I was evil, at least. So that's something.
Good. That's a good step, but this is a hard thing to overcome. I think one of the things we need to focus on more than we often do is being such loving people, such caring people, and such good listeners, that the other side is going to have a harder time actually painting you as a nut, or as evil, or as someone who hates babies, or whatever, eats puppies for breakfast. But that's something that we have to work on, I think, is our own character in how we have these conversations, and being
absolutely
very loving about it.
Yeah.
So we've also got a problem with technological distraction too. So we're fighting with people's attention, and so we have to be able to sort of, kind of like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, where we have to package things on Facebook in a very bite-sized way if it's philosophical, in order for anybody to read it or care. I face distraction.
Yeah, I hate that. I've bemoaned to my wife and many other people that we have so much technology, so many resources. You can literally get on your computer, and you can't quite look up everything that's been written, but you can get pretty close. And instead, What do? We go on Twitter and limit ourselves to, like, what is it, 50 or 100 words or something like that? I forget. And I'm like, well, why on earth would you want to do that? That's like the worst possible thing you could do, especially when you're discussing real problems and issues that are inevitably complicated and difficult. You're not going to get anything done by doing that.
No.
I'm still fighting going on Twitter, even though I do a podcast, for that reason, because I view that as a fundamentally poor way of communicating that's taking everything in the wrong direction. At least on Facebook, I can have long-form conversations with people, or at least try to.
Yeah, that's very true. So one of the tactics that I've tried to use in the past, and I still do this from time to time, is to try to use Facebook, Twitter, all those social media outlets as a hook to drive people deeper if they're interested. But otherwise, if they're not going to go deeper, they maybe can get something out of that little hook. But otherwise, if people are interested, I can send them somewhere that has more content. So that's something
a good idea.
That we can use it for our advantage.
Maybe I should go on Twitter and do that. I'll think about it.
Yeah, it's a really good way to use Twitter. So there's some other things that are challenges here. I don't want to get into too many of them because there's other things we need to talk about. But one of the things that I mentioned is that, or in this talk that I gave, is that people really fail to understand logic and rhetoric. They don't understand that some arguments that they're giving actually are fallacies, actually aren't good arguments at all. They're a common kind of popular way that I like to explain the fallacy is that it's a way of missing the point. It's a way of distracting from the point or totally missing the point altogether. And so that's something that we may need to help people through, is to understand logic. And then rhetoric is, well, you have to have content and emotion or emotional appeal and kind of a certain authority behind what you're saying, rather than the standard mere emotional outburst or emotional appeal that most people give. So we actually have to have content, a real argument there that has reasons for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I can give a good example of this from this podcast. A couple podcasts ago, I did one where I argued that the federal government should not address wealth inequality and poverty because it's very bad at it. And I had a bunch of statistics and hard data I was using. But what I opened and ended it with was rhetoric, because there's a guy, what was his name? Tom Fletcher, who Johnson actually used to launch his War on Poverty initiative. He went to Tom Fletcher's porch and did it for PR. And so I opened with that and then ended with, well, what happened to this guy? Turns out he never got out of poverty, and his story was terrible. His life was basically terrible. Nothing that the government did helped him. Now, if I just had that, that would only be rhetoric, because, well, the fact that the government didn't help this one guy doesn't necessarily mean that it can't help anyone, and that it's no good at it at all. That was only rhetoric. And where the actual data, the statistics and arguments I used in the middle of the podcast, that was actually argumentation as opposed to rhetoric.
Right. That's where you actually made your case, and we get so distracted by the emotional stuff. And that's there's not a problem with emotional appeals. That's sometimes really important, but we also need to know that that's not all there is. And sometimes our emotions can lead us astray, and can distract us from the facts. So, that's pretty important. And then fundamentally, I think we are fighting general religious illiteracy. So we need to be able to help people to learn that, wow, these religions teach some very different things than what we are commonly taught or commonly talk about. And a lot of people who are members of religions, including Christians, are illiterate about their own faith. They don't know what in the world they actually believe. And we have to know what we believe in order to know what we don't believe and what the differences are between us and others.
Yeah, I've lost count of the people who I know who were Christians or involved in the church some way, who walked away. And when I get a chance to talk to them, we'll say, well, why? What drove you away? What led you away? And they'll say, well, I don't like a God who does this, this, and this, or a church that does this, this, and this. And I would kind of say to them, well, neither do I. That's not what Christianity teaches about God, and that's not what the church is doing. If it is doing that, it's doing it wrong, and we need to stop that. And they would just be kind of shocked, like, well, who are you to say that that's what the church God's like? And I'm like, well, it's right here in the Bible. Didn't you read this? And they would just be shocked that nobody ever told them, no, God's not like that.
Right.
Or something similar along those lines.
Right. That's absolutely true. People need to realize that a lot of times their objections to belief aren't what the religion actually teaches. It's what's called a straw man. It's building up a weak version, kind of a caricature that is easy to knock down. So that's something we need to address. So here's some things that we need to figure out if we are going to have these discussions with people, which I firmly believe we need to start having these discussions in the right ways and in smart ways, not just on Facebook to stir the pot, but maybe in more relational contexts. But we have to realize that assuming that we have established with someone or with a group of people that the correspondence theory of truth or something like it is the case, assuming that that's been established, which that in and of itself is a starting point that might take you a while to establish. But assuming that, since spiritual belief is aimed at truth, everyone who believes something kind of assumes implicitly that it's true, whether or not they'll admit it. You don't believe something unless you think it's true. So you're aiming,
Yeah.
you're still playing darts, even though you're pretending you're not. You're still throwing darts at a dartboard, even though you may say there is no dartboard and I'm making my own target. But it's aimed at truth. So it doesn't necessarily hit that dartboard. So if that's the case, yeah, everyone believes they're correct, but that doesn't mean that they are correct. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily correct. So we can have a posture, even as Christians, of, yeah, I am convinced that I'm correct, but I'm still open to evaluate my own ideas with someone who doubts me. Because it doesn't mean I am infallible. It doesn't mean that I am completely always correct just because I have a belief. So a belief can be false.
Just because I believe I'm correct doesn't mean I should have an irrational certainty about my belief that I'm correct.
Right. So I may end up, it may turn out that I'm a terrible dart player. I just didn't know it.
I laugh because I actually am a terrible dart player in real life. So
I'm not so great either, but I haven't had a whole lot of practice with it either. But I also get very competitive, so I need to remove myself from that sort of scenario more often than not. But what we need to know is that all belief needs to theoretically be open to analysis, and we need to adopt that posture personally to model that for other people. So sincerity, if you sincerely believe you're right, it should make you more open to that analysis, because if you end up being right, then you're more committed than ever. Yes, if it's true, you're grounded, you're anchored.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. That's so poignant and necessary. I wish that was something more people would get. That, just like you're saying, if I'm sure that I'm right, then there's no way that a challenge can really threaten me, because the challenge has to be wrong.
Right. We don't need to be afraid of the truth. We need to seek it. Because I mean, and this is just a personal example, that when I was in 8th grade, I'd been brought up in a Christian context, a Christian home, a Christian school. And in 8th grade, I sort of came to the conclusion that, man, Christianity is a pain. There's a lot of stuff I've got to do, a lot of, I got to get up early on Sundays and go to church. And gosh, why in the world am I doing this unless it's true? And so that's the flip side of that, where you need to sort of know what's true about religion, because religion is hard. Spirituality, it demands things of you. And if it's going to demand things of you, my gosh, it better be right, or else you're wasting your time.
Yeah. And I would say you can also take from that if you have a religion or spirituality that really doesn't demand much of you, well, that should probably make you pretty suspicious that there's something wrong with it.
Right. It's probably created by some clever marketer or some television evangelist or someone. So, so here's the basic thing here. The basic principle is that belief should be seen as an aim at truth, not truth determining in and of itself, not truth making. So just because you have a belief, that doesn't mean it is true. A belief is an aim at truth. So it can still be analyzed. It still can be discussed and evaluated. So,
well, I really like your dart analogy for what it means to be truth aiming. What would you say it means for something to be truth making? I imagine that ties right back to the correspondence theory of truth.
Yeah. So if your belief makes truth, if you basically what that means is that you are your own dartboard, or you can determine where your own dartboard is. So you make your own rules of darts. You can throw it wherever you want, and where the target is just wherever you want it to be. It comes from you. You're the one who determines the rules. You're the one who determines the target. So there is no target out there in the universe outside of yourself. There's no way that other people can hold you accountable for the rules of the game, because the rules of the game come from within. And your belief, even and especially if you believe it really, really sincerely, then that means that that's true. Just true for you. That's the kicker.
Because then that would be the only way anything is true.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're aiming at truth, then that means that we are on a journey to some extent to figure out what is the case. And we're basically seeking accuracy is what we're seeking.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So here's what I think is the biggest missing link in the discussions of truth with respect to religion. So basically the question of what, if anything, in the religious context, in the religious world is true. Well, we're missing epistemology, the theory of knowledge, the theory of how do we know what we know. And at first I typed a properly basic epistemology, and I wanted to use that as a joke, but I'm actually not a reformed epistemologist, and so I didn't want to, hint. I didn't want to make people think, oh, she's nodding Dalvin Planiga because she's a Plantingan. No, I'm actually not. I'm I don't want to get into that, but
that's a fascinating topic, but yeah, a long discussion.
Yeah,
so
that might have to be another day. A sufficiently basic epistemology. So not anything formal. You don't have to take a massively difficult epistemology philosophy class. You just have to understand that there is a basic requirement that in order to have knowledge, your belief has to have good enough reasons to actually be true, or at least to be as close to truth as possible. So that's epistemology in a nutshell. So we have to work to upgrade our knowledge into, upgrade our belief into knowledge, essentially. Okay.
So this might be something that would take too long, but do you know of do you think that people who are like professional epistemologists who will then say things like, well, knowledge is justified true belief, but we need something else because Edmund Gettier showed it doesn't always work when it's just justified true belief. Are they just making too much out of it, making it too complicated, or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm really glad you asked that question. So classically, as you know, knowledge has been determined to be, or at least defined as, justified true belief. So you have a belief.
Plato. Mm-hmm.
Right. You have a belief. It has to have good reasons for it, which is justification. And those reasons have to be good enough to where you are as close to truth as possible. It is basically, and how close to truth you can get is a philosophical discussion in and of itself. But, which gets crazy. But that's the gist of it. And Edmund Gettier came along, and I mean, the guy, it's so funny. He made his living off of this one article, essentially, that challenged this view. And he said, he made an example of a guy that goes into a job interview. And I can't remember, he used Smith and Jones, and I can't remember which one was which, but Smith and Jones are both in a job interview. Jones goes in first. Smith happens to notice that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. And then once Jones goes into the office, the president of the company walks by and kind of says to Smith, hey, just so you know, Jones is going to get that job. And so Smith tells himself, hey, wow, I guess then the guy who's going to get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Well, in a weird turn of events, Jones, I guess, botches the interview. Something comes out that really upsets the president of the company. And Smith goes in and nails the interview, gets the job. Smith reaches in his own pocket and realizes, wow, I have 10 coins in my pocket too. I was right. The guy who wins the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Wow, I was right. Well, here's what's funny is so many people in philosophy, in analytic philosophy specifically, have thought, oh, wow, Edmund Gettier completely killed the justified true belief condition for truth. And I don't think this is true at all. I mean, yes, the majority of philosophers assume this, but gosh, the majority of philosophers have assumed a lot of things throughout the ages that have gotten overturned or fallen out of favor 10 years later. So we can't make that our guiding principle. But here's the issue is, and even an atheist, Bertrand Russell, is one who I think anticipated this objection and defeated it before the objection even came around.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can find on my screen here, this was from Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, in case you're interested.
Great book, yeah.
Yeah,
I
the chapter,
that more highly to people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the chapter on truth and falsehood, he kind of anticipates a response to Gettier before Gettier. But anyway, all that to say, Gettier missed something pretty big, and that is the idea that you cannot, justification only works if your beliefs or if your justification is true. You can't assume. So what Smith was saying in The Guy Who Wins the Job Has 10 Coins in His Pocket, well, the guy who wins the job in Smith's mind is Jones, not Smith. He's saying essentially Jones is winning the job and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. So then if Smith wins the job, he's actually wrong, right? Because his justification was, I was told that Jones was going to win. So he's basing his belief on a false assumption, and his conclusion then is false if you actually unpack it fully.
So you're saying in that example, there's equivocation when he's talking about the man who has 10 coins in his pocket is going to get the job, because in the first sense it refers to Jones, and in the second sense it refers to Smith.
Right. And there's also a fancy philosophical term here that you can throw in, where you can say this actually has what's called an enthymeme in it, which I love this word. It's one that you rarely use, but what that means is an enthymeme is a hidden premise. It's an unspoken but assumed and necessary premise in the argument. So what Smith is saying basically is the guy who has 10 coins in his pocket is Jones. The guy who's going to win is Jones, because I was told that the guy who's going to win is Jones. Therefore, Jones is the winner and has 10 coins in his pocket because he's the one that has 10 coins in his pocket. So the enthymeme means there's a hidden piece there that's not explicitly stated that is meant. So then he can't then turn around and say, oh, I was right, Smith wins the job because Smith has 10 coins in his pocket. No, you were referring to Jones, not to Smith.
Wow, I think that's fantastic. I've never heard anybody give a response to the Gettier problems like that. That's really great. I mean, it just seems so obvious and simple when you say it. And here, like, I went to a whole conference on epistemology where they were trying to figure out what should we do after Gettier, and nobody even tried to do anything like that. So,
well, this is why philosophy is so fascinating to me, is because so many people seem to assume just the consensus, the general consensus. And that's not good philosophy. It's not how we do it. It's not how we should do it. So
you should try to question everything as much as you can, even though it's hard to do. So
right. There's a helpful sort of skepticism that we can have that is not a deep-rooted, permanent sort of skepticism. But anyway, so Tim McGrew, by the way, Tim and Lydia McGrew are really good on this. They wrote an article a while ago. I can't remember what it was called, but they did write an article on the Gettier problem that influenced me very significantly. So
I'll have to look that up. Epistemology is one of the areas that I tend to be really interested in, and I've come across some other things Tim McGrew has written and listened to a couple of his lectures online, and was generally pretty impressed. So
he's one of the best in epistemology today, I believe. So okay, so let's go back to this idea of spiritual belief being aimed at truth and needing epistemology to work. We need to understand how we come to knowledge, how we can discuss our knowledge, that sort of thing. So the task of the rational person, and this is just like what we were talking about, we need to maximize our true beliefs and minimize our false beliefs. And this is through the process of seeking justification or good reasons for all important beliefs. So here's basically my proposal for kind of our way forward. How do we practically do this then? If we understand epistemology sufficiently, not technically, well, this is where truth spoken in love, I think, is the way forward. That we need a strong commitment to truth, absolutely. We don't need to waver on truth. You don't waver on math problems. Math, it either is right or wrong. But it's also invisible, like the spiritual. We're not entitled to our own solutions to math problems. So I think analogously, we're not entitled to our own spiritual solutions. We need to actually have those discussions. We also need to have an understanding of sociologist Peter Berger's concept. This is a term he coined, plausibility structures. This is an idea where everyone's worldview is structured in such a way that certain ideas that you introduce to the person may or may not seem plausible because of the other things they believe. So if they don't believe in the correspondence theory of truth, the idea that there is a true and false concept of religious truth, or maybe, let me rephrase that, there is the possibility that a religion could be wrong, is not going to make sense to them. If someone believes in a purely naturalistic universe, then spirituality in general makes very little sense, if any. So that's the concept of plausibility structures. We have to understand someone's worldview, someone's essential web of fundamental beliefs, or most important beliefs, in order to know what they are going to be tempted to believe and what they are going to not have any possibility of believing until we discuss some things further.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I can think a guy I was talking to probably about a year ago who had been a Christian for a while, and then I guess he left, and he and I had talked politics online a little bit, and one day he sent me a message saying, "Phil, you're kind of a reasonable guy. How is it you deal with these 10 issues relating to Christianity that made me walk away?" And I was like, wow, you think I'm reasonable? I've either deceived you pretty well or I'm doing something right. So, so I conversed with him a little bit, and I found out that he was still convinced that Christ was the divine Son of God who rose from the dead. And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, this is easy. I've almost everything all the explanations I can give you for, like he was talking about, how you deal with supposed atrocities in the Old Testament, or a lack of archaeological evidence for the Exodus and things like that. I'm thinking, but if you already are convinced that Christ is divine and rose from the dead, this is easy, because you're going to think automatically you're going to find almost all the solutions I'm going to give you at least plausible. Even if you don't like what you're saying there, even if he doesn't quite buy them, he's going to at least be able to see, oh, there's sense in that. Where if he'd, say, become a atheistic naturalist who didn't believe in anything supernatural, then explanations I could give him for that kind of stuff wouldn't even be remotely plausible.
Right, exactly. And what this requires is enough respect for the other person and enough love for another person that we listen to them enough to determine what they believe and what they don't believe. So you only knew that because you listened, and that's probably why this person found you reasonable, because you listened. And that's rare, and it's not a hard thing for us to practice, but it's, for some reason, just very uncommon.
Yes, it is, unfortunately so.
Yeah, but it's necessary. We also need, if we're Christians, we need to develop what I call, and what a lot of people call, a theology of religions, which means an understanding that there is truth to be found in other religions. It's just that it's not enough. It's not good enough. So we also need to understand the concept of the exclusivity of the gospel, that you cannot come to Christ without knowing Christ and without knowing what he did and without recognizing why you need what he did on the cross. And so we have to understand the theology of religion in general, of why we need to accept Christ. And then we have to understand why it is that is the only way, and why there is the existence of other religions when there's some truth in there, but it's not enough. So we have to be able to develop, and I think maybe churches need to pursue this and start teaching this and exploring this so that Christians are prepared for this idea that, yes, Christianity is an exclusive religion, and yet that does not mean there's no truth elsewhere. It just means we have to reason together to understand why it's necessary that there only be one way and why it is that way.
Yeah, when I got my undergraduate degree at Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri, and when I was going there, one of the big taglines they had there is "All truth is God's truth," which was a relatively simplistic way of saying what you're getting at there. What they meant by it, at least in the best sense, is if you find something true elsewhere, that's God's truth, even if it comes from a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim source, whatever. If it's true, that's just as much God's truth as it is if it was something that came right from the lips of Christ.
Right, right. And that's the concept, or that's drawing from the concept of general revelation, that God has revealed himself in various ways through all of reality to all people. He just hasn't revealed everything specifically through those means. So specifically, that's special revelation. That's what we get through Scripture. But generally, people do hit on certain themes and certain truths that are God's truth. And part of that is because they are also made in the image and likeness of God. They are also creatures of God. So they are going to have a need and an interest in certain things that kind of align with how we were created. So basically being moral beings. We're created to be moral beings. So you're going to find moral truth in some other religions. It just may not be enough. And it won't be enough. So we also finally, and this is the biggest thing, that we need to learn how to focus on both the similarities between religions, and that's what can kind of build relationships, is commonalities and common ground. You know, the kind of, hey, you too? Oh, wow, I thought I was the only one. That's C.S. Lewis's view of how friendship happens, right? Two people who say, hey, you too? I thought I was the only one. But we also need to have enough relational capital, enough respect with one another to discuss differences among these religions in order to pursue what is actually true. So that's essentially what I think the way forward is similarities and differences together in the context of loving relationships with one another.
Okay. So what you're saying is, if I'm hearing you right, we should be pursuing truth by exploring the differences between, obviously not just religions, but various worldviews and philosophies and things like that. But the best way to do it is when you're within some type of a relationship with somebody else. Like if, our neighbors go to the same church as us here, but suppose they were Muslims or something. Well, I could then develop a relationship with them over time and then start talking about the differences between Islam and Christianity.
Right. I think that is going to be the best way forward, the most fruitful way forward. However, I will say that even if you have to speak to a large audience, that's maybe a mixed group, you can still practice a loving posture. And some of the ways you can do that is by not oversimplifying other religions, by not misrepresenting other religions, by kind of packaging your words carefully and in the most gracious way possible. So there's ways to do this through sort of your standard lecture, large group settings too. But I do think that probably in our society, where people are so distracted already and so overwhelmed with information, they need to respect you as an individual and love you as an individual enough to care what you think, so that they actually listen for more than 5 seconds.
Yeah. And that's the hard part, I imagine.
It is. We have to actually be good people, be people worth listening to.
Yeah, that's a part that's particularly hard for me because, as my wife and many other people have told me, I tend to be a very blunt and abrupt person because I care so much about what's true that I'll, so to speak, push everything aside, and sometimes even everyone else, just to get at what's true. And
Yeah,
usually
me
my
too.
motivation there is, well, if it's true, that is what's best for you. So I'm actually being loving by showing you what's true. And in a certain sense, that's right. But in another sense, it probably pushes people away too.
Right. It can. And I'm that way too. I think, everybody who's interested in philosophy tends to have a certain personality type for sure. And it tends to be that type. But right, it's we can hold firmly to the idea of the importance of truth while recognizing that the way we package it and the way we go about it needs to be kind of carefully calibrated to the people we're with and very sensitive to the people we're with.
And we do that by, like you said earlier, just listening to them, hearing where they're at, not assuming things, maybe asking them, I don't know, like 20 questions about what they think before we then turn around and throw up our Socratic style
Right.
question to show them that they believe a contradiction or something like that.
Right. So don't approach it like you're trying to trap them, Ask questions that actually make them feel like, shockingly, you really truly care about why they think that. And maybe you actually believe that this person, once again, shockingly, is not an idiot and probably has decent reasons for believing why they believe or what they believe. But that those reasons don't have to be right to be decent reasons.
Mm-hmm.
They just, that may be all that person knows at the time. And given what they know, their conclusion actually probably makes sense. It may not, but it might. And you need to have the posture, and I need to have the posture of assuming the best about people, not assuming that they're stupid or out of touch just because we have arrived at the truth. They maybe just haven't had an opportunity to go down the path that we've been down.
Yes, I really like that. I've said before on this podcast and to many other people that a lot of problems could be quickly solved if we'd all just operate from a principle of charity, wherein we don't think or assume the worst of somebody else unless we have good reason to do so. That is, if somebody says or does something that seems wacky, stupid, or offensive, unless you have good reason to think they did that with malice, assume they didn't do it with malice. Assume they didn't know what they were talking about. They made a mistake. They misspoke or something along those lines, rather than just assuming they're stupid or evil.
Right. And it should be really, really tough to get to that point. We shouldn't be immediately drawing that conclusion of people that they're, saying things in malice or they're clearly insane or something like that. They need to work to earn that.
Think about how better things would probably function. Well, since the President's State of the Union was last night, as I referenced before, think about how better things would probably function between the two parties if they at least tried to operate from that principle.
Oh my goodness. It would be a different world, and it would actually, we might actually have conversations. That would be amazing.
Cool. Well, I think this is all great. Thank you so much for coming on and walking us through this. I love doing conversations like this that are both philosophical but also practical and helpful, and where people who aren't like you and me, who study philosophy for fun in our livelihoods, can actually follow along and get some benefit from it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope it was beneficial, and it was certainly enjoyable for me to have someone who invites me to be nerdy. That's nice.
Well, that's what I'm all about. If you ever get the chance, I'd love to have you back on and we can just discuss ontological arguments forever. I spent like a year researching and writing on that, and you're obviously way more into it than I am, so that would be wonderful. So
that would be a lot of fun. I'm for it.
Okay. Well, if people who listen wanted to get a hold of you, you mentioned you're on Twitter, and would that be a good place to contact you?
Well,
or
for
some
me,
other places?
I actually don't use Twitter very much. I think the best way to get a hold of me probably is through my website, which is justifiedfaith.com.
Okay.
And that's actually,
a good
yes,
title.
epistemology reference.
Yeah, that's good. That's clever. I kind of wish I'd thought of that and taken it before you got it. So.
Yeah, I love epistemology. But anyway, and you also could friend me on Facebook. Most of the time, though, on Facebook, I tend to just post, dog things, and I train horses and horse things, stuff like that. But every now and then I will share a talk I'm giving, or a talk that I think a colleague is giving that you'll appreciate or like, or videos, stuff like that. So you can certainly friend me on Facebook, but I think my website is probably the best place to get a hold of me.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure to put a link up to that on the Facebook page for the show and stuff like that. So, and are there any other like resources along these lines that you could recommend to people?
Yes, there are. So I've got some resources broken up into levels: introductory level, mid-level, and then advanced. And these are all books that I recommend in the class that I teach at Denver Seminary called Religious Pluralism, where we discuss a lot of this stuff. So some introductory books that are great is God is Not One, which is by Stephen Prothero, which came out in 2011. That is not by a Christian. He's very sociologically astute. He's excellent. There's another one that is by Christians called Relativism: Feet Firmly Planted in Mid-Air, which is by Francis Beckwith and Greg Kokel, which came out in 1998. Still very relevant. Excellent. Another one by Stephen Prothero is called Religious Literacy. This is from 1998, but again, it's still relevant. It's excellent. I highly, highly recommend that you read this. The subtitle here is What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. And it's very, very good. It's a relatively quick read. So some mid-level ones one is a Rumor of Angels: Modern Society and the Rediscovery of the Supernatural by Peter Berger. Peter Berger is the sociologist. He's no longer alive, but he's the sociologist I mentioned earlier that had the idea of plausibility structures.
Yeah. Is that the book where he goes into? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Does he go into plausibility structures in that book, or is that elsewhere? Okay.
He does.
Good.
Yeah. So that's from 1970, but it's a classic. I highly recommend it. Then there's another one called Christianity and Religious Diversity, which is called Clarifying Christian Commitments in a Globalizing Age by Harold Netland. That's fairly recent, 2015. That one's excellent. Harold Netland is both sociologically astute because he is a missiology professor, so missions, Christians and missions. But he also is a philosopher. He's outstanding because he is that rare combination of the two. So there's a couple of advanced books. These are very much epistemology books. These are highly nerdy philosophy books. So warning, if you're not into philosophy, if you don't have a background in philosophy, I wouldn't recommend getting these, but they're very good if you are some degree of philosopher. So one is Christian Perspectives on Religious Knowledge, edited by C. Stephen Evans and Merrill Westphal. This is from 1993. And the second one that I'd recommend is Rationality and Religious Commitment by Robert Audi, Audi, and that's from 2011. So those are my resources. I highly recommend you dig in somewhere along those lines.
Well, fantastic. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's all good stuff. I love it all.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on and giving us those resources. You've given me, and I think everybody who listens, a lot to think about. So now it's time for people who are listening, write in and let me know what you think. What do you think of Sarah's ideas and theses here as we work through? Did we make any comments or suggestions that you thought were wrong? Well, write in and tell us about it. That's kind of the whole point we were trying to get in here. And you can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I started a Facebook group for the show. That's The Examined Life with Phil on Facebook. And yeah, as Sarah said, you can get a hold of her at justifiedfaith.com. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.